Okay, good morning. Thanks for coming to our second day of the workshop on building pluralistic and inclusive states post-Arab Spring. This morning we're going to start off with an introduction by Dr. Tarek Mitri, the director of the Isam Faris Institute, and we will have the keynote address of the day by Dr. Khalwa Matar after Dr. Mitri. And then we will continue with our first panel of the day. So I want to introduce Dr. Mitri. Dr. Mitri is the director of the Institute of the Isam Faris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut, a position he's held since 2014. He's the former special representative of the United Nations General Secretary in Libya. Dr. Mitri has served in 4 different governments as Lebanon's Minister of Information, of the Environment, of Administrative Development and Culture, and as acting foreign minister. He's also a member of the Strategic Board of Lebanon's University St. Joseph, this chair of the Board of Trustees of the Institute for Palestine Studies, and a member of the Board of Directors of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. He has lectured at a number of universities in Lebanon, Europe, and North America, such as University of Geneva, Harvard, and AUB. Dr. Mitri has extensive experience promoting Christian-Muslim relations and has published on the topic. So this is a very good opportunity for us to benefit from his scholarly and personal experience. Please welcome Dr. Mitri.
Thank you very much. I should have been here yesterday morning to welcome you all in this auditorium. I hope it's not too cold here. We're very pleased that your deliberations went well yesterday. I couldn't be here. I was away, arrived last night. Much of what you've been talking about, I believe, has been with us for a good number of years. Here at the Institute, we started a process of reflection and research on issues of transition, as they like to call it in the United Nations, and particularly on issues of inclusion in a fragmented Arab world. We started in the year 2000 and early 2016 with a major conference on the Arab uprisings, and much to our surprise, a pleasant surprise, there were a number of young scholars, mostly from Arab North Africa, that had joined us in trying to it was premature, probably, to analyze why is it that the promises of the Arab uprising were not kept. But that process of discussion went on for years. We've organized a couple of conferences with Princeton, and there's not a single month that passes without our institute organizing a panel, a lecture, or a small conference on what lessons need to be drawn, whether this is possible to draw lessons from what has happened, whether it is possible less than 7 years since those Arab uprisings to make a proper evaluation. It is often said that Xu Enlai, who had knowledge of the history of France, when asked to give an opinion about the French Revolution, said that it was too early to make a judgment on the French Revolution. So I'm one of those who think that it is still too early to make statements about the so-called failure of Arab uprisings. The few notes I'll share with you are primarily draw on those discussions we've had here, but also some of them draw on my own experience and reflection. I will be very short. I think overstating failures is the other side of what was an exaggerated enthusiasm that was evoked by the use of the metaphor of the Arab Spring. Such use brought to memory many short-living springs. In our region, Damascus Spring, in Eastern Europe, the Prague Spring, and 19th century Europe, in the 1848 Spring. But their closure seemed to overshadow that all these springs had a long-lasting effect. And people speak about their failure, less about their long-lasting effects. Disillusionment, uncertainty, and fear notwithstanding, the yearning for dignity, freedom, political participation, which motivated revolutions against patrimonial authoritarian regimes, could not be dismissed as ephemeral. The broad-based social demand for democracy, no matter how vaguely defined is democracy in the Arab world, is often ignored by those who precipitously opt for a culturalist explanation of our difficulty to transition towards a democratic polity and society. Precarious national structures and the related fragility of national cohesion, exacerbated further by the rapid and unanticipated collapse of the old order, favor the tendency in our part of the world to overemphasize the strength of primordial ties in comparison with the civic ties that are constitutive of a modern democratic polity and society. One could not ignore the resurgence, I'd rather say the reinvention of sub-national identities and the centrifugal forces at work in many Arab countries. Many members of communities, not only minority communities, religious or ethnic, seem to have lost their aspiration to a state for all. And they seem to beg for a power structure that can protect them, sometimes from another community. Political and electoral strategies of mobilization have accentuated communalism and encouraged the surfacing of narratives of victimhood. And it's amazing how much competition for victimhood, if I may, there is in the region. You just go to Iraq, to mention one country, and members of different communities look at themselves, perceive themselves to be victims. And the narrative of victimhood is, to be sure, emotional, but can be equally aggressive. Ethnic groups and ethnicized religious groups are both actors and victims of identity politics. Throughout the 20th century, their members struggle to assert themselves and be recognized as citizens. But many of them retreated into minority-centered, enclaved when possible, communities. And the very conflicts that undermined what is left of the state, became, for many rulers of the region, a source of legitimacy, a cause for further entrenching and distraction from addressing problems that those rulers were neither capable nor willing to solve, such as Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Yemen. It is therefore not a surprise to see violence becoming a policy by default. Transition from authoritarian regimes, whether patrimonial or not, to democracy has proved to be more arduous than anticipated. Today, the social demand for security and stability in a context of a bloody disorder is interpreted in some countries, such as in Egypt, as a demand for return to an authoritarian rule. But it is not. For repression is far less tolerated than before, and the call for political participation could not be silenced. The legacy of authoritarian regimes, I worked in Libya, weighs heavily. One cannot understress how it weighed heavily on political conduct of both old and emerging elites, and the management of transition, nurturing suspicions and mutual fears. Rebuilding state institutions that were left in desolation was severely hindered. To be sure, the shortfalls of transition could not be overstated. The deficit in competence and experience of large segments of the new political elites, the weakness of political forces with a social base that is attached to democratic values or aspiring to a democratic order, all of those may explain the volatility of state building. Progress on the arduous road towards democratic transformation could not be achieved by adopting a presumably universal model of transition. A paradigm for social change and political change has to be better suited to the realities of today, not the lingering hope of an earlier era. Precipitation in moving forward did not adequately recognize the strength of subnational identity assertion, nor those of our cultural resistance, if I may, to new norms of political practice. Not enough time was given in our part of the world to the first but crucial phase of transition, which is supposed to establish rules for public life accepted by all and ensuring the widest political participation, underlining inclusivity as an energizing principle. Such principle is the principle of inclusivity is considered to be costly for those who are in power, but also by some who oppose them, especially when there are those who claim they are representing majorities. Majorities represented in this manner refrain from reaching out to the fearful minorities. I'm not talking only about religious and ethnic minorities, about political minorities as well, who always fear being excluded. And their inability to include has undoubtedly contributed to the radicalization of the excluded. But times of uncertainty and fear are also times of change. The tension of turning victims into actors may not be resolved in the near future. Recognizing the present fragmentation and communalization is inevitable, but designing political systems that mirror them assumes that they are never-changing realities. Voices that seem to be suppressed today would not be voices silenced forever. In the midst of chaos and destruction, the emergence of forces striving towards citizenship and national unity may become, rather than an impossible dream, a principle of hope. It's good to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mitri.